In this episode, I'm going to walk you through how to find the exact keywords that your competitors are using right now to get found in search results on players like Apple and Spotify, and the first steps that you can take to make sure your podcast appears in those search results so that more listeners can find your show. Because I guarantee you, as the podcasting space continues to get more crowded, if you are not showing up in the right searches, someone else is. And I'm going to help you avoid that so that you can create a podcast that listeners literally cannot ignore. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. If you caught the episode right before this one, then you already know why having a keyword strategy for your podcast is more critical now than it ever has been ever in the history of podcasting. SEO has been around for a long time, especially when it comes to Google, search, YouTube, Pinterest, websites, blog posts, and all the things that we traditionally think of when we think of SEO. It's also been present in podcasting for a very long time, but not a lot of people are utilizing it. And my prediction is that SEO is going to become something that you will see more and more people start to teach in the podcasting space. Just remember, you heard it here first, because it is now easier than ever to actually track and see if your keyword strategy is helping you get found. And this is why keywords, SEO, when it comes to podcasting, is one of those things that I've taught under the radar for the last 4 years. But I've only taught to those people who are willing to do whatever it takes to grow their podcast, because until now, we didn't have a way to measure it very accurately how well it was working. But now we do. And so with that in mind, this is going to be one of those underrated strategies that can get you so far when it comes to podcast discoverability. Because as the space continues to get more crowded, the more often you can appear in search results, guess what? The more listeners are going to find you. So the goal is really to find 10 to 15 keywords or key phrases that you want to dominate. Because when you can dominate a keyword, you can dominate the competition. And knowing how to do this strategically in your podcast will help increase the likelihood of your show appearing at the top of the search results for listeners who are already searching for a show like yours. So think of it like this. Using keywords is how Apple and Spotify decide where your show belongs in the search results. It helps connect your show to more listeners. But if you're not giving Apple and Spotify the right directions, well, they're not going to know how to help your audience find you. So you can think of it kind of like a map. You are literally going to be telling Apple and Spotify exactly who to show your show to and exactly the type of listener that you are looking for, so that Apple can then go out and connect you with those listeners, and Spotify can go out and connect you with those listeners. So any keywords that you use, you want them to be relevant. They've got to match what your audience is already actually searching for. They've got to be specific, because if you know anything about keywords, the niche ones tend to outperform the broad ones. Now, it's a delicate balance, because you want to make sure that there's enough searchability for that keyword term or keyword phrase, because otherwise, if nobody's searching for it, then it does you no good. But think about it this way. From a listener perspective, having more niche keywords is going to attract a more targeted listener. Here's an example. Let's say your show is about productivity. So a broad keyword might be productivity tips, but a niche keyword that would attract your targeted listener, the ideal listener who you are looking for, could be time blocking for busy moms. So your keyword should be specific, it should be relevant, and it should be something that your audience is already searching for. So we want to make sure we're checking those boxes here. And then once you know exactly what keywords you should be using, we got to place them in the right places, all of the written elements of your podcast, both previously, if you've got an existing podcast, or from scratch, if you're starting your podcast for the first time. You want to make sure that you are doing this. Now, if you listened to the episode before this one and you did the homework that I gave you, you should already have a big list of lots of keywords that we could potentially use. The next step is to narrow that down. And a lot of people skip this part. They just assume that they know what is good, quote unquote good, without actually doing the research, without actually even looking at the competition and what the competition is using, or researching to see, okay, is this a term that my people are actually searching for? Is this a really competitive keyword? Is this a keyword that is actually going to help me get found and match me with the right listener? So the very first step to narrowing down that big keyword list that you made in the episode before this one is to actually do a competitor analysis. You want to look at similar shows in your niche, in your category, and you want to notice what words are they using? What words keep coming up again and again inside of their episode titles or their episode descriptions or the podcast name itself? And this is where I love to use a little bit of help from AI, because this is something that AI could easily help you figure out. Okay, so here's the prompt that you're going to type into ChatGPT. If you're somewhere where you can write this down, get your pen ready. If not, be prepared to come back to this because you're going to want this exact prompt to do this research. Here it is. Give me the 10 most optimized SEO keywords in the metadata of this podcast using only data from this link. And you will provide the link to the podcast. I usually use the Apple link. And I paste that into ChatGPT and I let it give me a list. Now, here's the thing. ChatGPT does not actually know the competitiveness of those keywords, the searchability of those keywords, or the relevance of those keywords. But what it can do is give you keywords that are frequently appearing in the metadata, which is basically just a fancy way of saying in all of the text of other podcasts that are essentially competitors to you. So when you're doing this step of your keyword research, I recommend doing at least 10 of the top podcasts in your category on your specific topic that you would consider direct competitors. That's the key. No pun intended. I did this for 17 podcasts for our show because I do everything overkill, but that's just me. You do you, okay? At least 10. Here's what you're looking for. You're looking for shows that are on your topic. You're looking for shows that are a direct competitor to you. Even if you believe in collaboration over competition, that's great, but these essentially are shows that a listener is comparing. It's no different than if a listener was looking on Amazon for a product to buy and they had the exact same product pulled up by two different retailers and they were just trying to figure out which one is going to be the best one for them. So your direct competitors, because these are other shows that a listener could potentially listen to if they were choosing between your show and the other show. So let's say if you're in commercial real estate, don't worry about the residential real estate podcasts if your direct competitors are commercial. For me, I was looking at podcasts that were focused on podcasting for business growth, not so much tech or industry news types of podcasts. You want to really consider the shows that are actively releasing an episode every week and have been doing so for at least a year or more. But that said, don't not consider not active shows. Okay. Limited series podcasts are an exception because some of those podcasts, there are some, especially in certain genres, where they will drop literally 8 episodes or 10 episodes, and that is the podcast. And that's all it is. So if it's a limited series podcast, you definitely want to consider that. But you also want to consider inactive podcasts, because if they had 100 episodes and they stopped, but their show can still be found and value can still be gained from listening, then guess what? Listeners can find it too. Listeners are likely going to be more inclined to click an active podcast over an inactive one, but you do want to take those inactive ones into consideration, especially if they are easy to find and if they are popping up in your research. So based on this, you're then going to add those keywords to your list that you identify that your competitors are using. And what I want you to notice here is any overlap. Which keywords are being used a lot? Which keywords have you identified that are different? That maybe they're not being utilized a lot, but that are really targeted and that would be really relevant if a listener were to type that in. Because to stand out in search results, your keyword strategy, it has to do 2 things. It has to match what your audience is actively searching for, as I mentioned a moment ago, and it has to give you an edge over your competition. So it's not only about describing your show to Apple and to Spotify. It's also about positioning your podcast to be the most relevant choice when someone is deciding between your show and another show like yours. So between the previous episode and this one, so far you have learned how to build a list of keywords based on what you think your audience is searching for and identifying those adjacent topics that the search engines will tell you that others are searching for based on those search terms. And you've also learned how to spy on your competitors to see what keywords they're using and to look and see, okay, based on what I teach and the listeners that I want to reach, which keywords might be the best for me. So the next step to narrowing down this list to your short list of 10 to 15 keywords to dominate is to do the research to actually see if these keywords are good keywords for you. To do that, you're going to need to actually analyze these keywords or key phrases so that you know which ones to prioritize. So there are 2 recommendations that I would give you for doing this. One of them is with our friends over at Ausha.co. I'm going to link in the show notes to Ausha because this is the only tool that we have as of this date, okay? Because I expect that there will be more soon. This is going to be a thing here pretty soon, I promise you. But as of right now, Ausha.co, this is the only podcast specific way that we have to measure the frequency that certain keywords are being used across Apple and Spotify and the competition of those keywords. Now, Ausha.co is not free, but if you are serious about podcast growth, it is so worth it. It is 100% worth it. We have been testing this and we are currently ranking number 1 in 7 different keywords in Apple, just simply through being able to track and measure and refine our strategy. And we're ranking number 1 in 5 different keywords on Spotify and number 3 on 2 additional keywords in Spotify. And again, we're continuing to refine our approach. And it's nice to know what's actually working specific to podcasting. That said, maybe you know nothing about SEO, or maybe you know a little bit, but you're not really ready to go and invest in some sort of high performance dashboard that you could use to track your results. You're just kind of looking to dial in your strategy enough so that you can start plugging those keywords in and hopefully start appearing at the top of those search results, which you can track to some degree simply by using that in your podcast metadata and then actually searching for that and seeing if your podcast is one of the ones that pops up. So the free tool that you can use for this, there's a lot of them, but I use Google Keyword Planner. And we use this for all the blog posts and everything that we optimize as far as quote unquote old-fashioned SEO goes, all on our website, everything else, all the metadata there. So this can give you a general sense of how frequently that search term is being searched on Google. And so this can give you a good general idea or a good general direction to go or to not go with your keywords. What you're looking for is a high search volume, low competition, and highly relevant keywords. Keywords that have high competition are going to be harder to rank for. Keywords with low search volume, well, nobody's looking for them, so it's not really going to do you any good. But most of all, what we want is we want relevance. So you want relevant keywords targeted to your ideal listener with a high search volume and low competition. And this is how we're going to narrow down that list to find 10 to 15 keywords to dominate. And then once you have those keywords dialed in, you're going to consistently use them throughout the text fields of your podcast. Now, I will caveat this and say, do not keyword stuff those keywords into every single episode title or show notes that you write or your podcast description. Just like Google and just like traditional SEO, podcast SEO operates much the same way, where they will actually penalize you if they can tell that you are just hawking those keywords in there just to get found. You want to use them naturally throughout your text. You want to use them strategically throughout your text. And you also want to speak them inside of your podcast because those transcripts get transcribed and utilized on different players as well. And to be totally fair, there is more nuance to building a keyword strategy than what we can cover here in a podcast episode. But with the bones of this approach, you will already be light years ahead of those who haven't even given a thought about podcast SEO yet, or those who have maybe thought about it but really aren't doing it to the degree that you can be doing it. And that's why I love this strategy, is because it is so simple. Once it's built, it's not something you have to repeatedly do, like podcast guesting, where you're always having to guest on other podcasts in order to get a return from it. No. And it operates on the same cumulative or compounding effect that podcasting already operates on. This compounding effect that a little bit done consistently over time will eventually yield the biggest results. No different than investing in the stock market. And so think of SEO that way. It's not a strategy that you're continually having to do. Once it's built, you'll have to tweak it a little bit. You'll have to refine it a little bit and monitor it. But it is something that will grow with your podcast and compound with every new episode that you create. And I don't know about you, but I am all for strategies that do not take up any extra time or bandwidth on my plate. Think about it. You already have to come up with an episode title every week. You already have to come up with show notes for your podcast every time you release an episode. You are already speaking inside of every episode. There's going to be a transcript for that episode. So once you have your keyword shortlist, now you just start incorporating that into the titles, into the show notes, into the spoken parts of your podcast, and do it naturally and strategically over and over again. And it will compound over time, and it can compound very quickly. So I promise you, a lot more people are going to start talking about this. A lot more people are going to start doing this as podcasting continues to grow and get more competitive, because this is going to be one of the ways that you can stand out. So if you are serious about the growth of your podcast, starting now is going to give you an edge in a space where so many podcasters are not even thinking about SEO yet. But they will, I promise you. So to me, it is a non-negotiable part of any podcast growth strategy. And speaking of podcast growth, if you are someone who is serious about growing your podcast, you're going to love the next episode because I have a very special guest joining me, and we're going to zoom out and we're going to look at the podcasting industry as a whole, where we've been, where we're headed, and what you're going to need to know to stay ahead in an increasingly competitive podcast landscape. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.